She sang to soothe a stranger, never knowing her voice would awaken a family, heal an old man's heart, and stir love in the soul of the man listening from the shadows. In a mansion silenced by grief, one nurse's nightly lullabies become the thread that weaves together broken pasts, unexpected love, and a second chance at joy. Hello family, welcome to True Life Stories. Please subscribe and leave a like for us, it means the world to us. Also share this video to your friends and loved ones and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. The Grand Blake estate sat at the end of a winding road, nestled among quiet hills that overlooked the sleepy edge of the city. The house, regal but weary, bore the echoes of time. Creaking floors, faded portraits, and chandeliers that hadn't shimmered like they used to. Inside, behind drawn curtains and heavy silence, lived Mr. Harold Blake, a man once renowned for his business brilliance, now reduced by age and illness to a shadow of himself. Harold's condition had declined over the last year. The stroke had taken its toll on his speech and mobility, but worse was the slow erosion of his spirit. Since his wife passed nearly a decade ago, Harold had become more withdrawn. Nurses came and went, some too stiff, others too indifferent, and a few too scared of his sharp tongue and colder eyes. It was his estate manager, Mrs. Clarkson, who had made the call. "She's young, but she comes highly recommended," Clarkson said, placing a thin file on the table beside Harold's untouched tea. He didn't look up. The last one was highly recommended too. She left in tears after 2 days. Clarkson sighed. "This one is different. Her name is Susan. She's not just a nurse. She cares." Harold grunted, a mixture of skepticism and fatigue. The next morning, Susan arrived. Dressed in a simple blue uniform, her tightly coiled hair neatly pulled back, she clutched a canvas bag against her side and looked up at the house with a long breath. It wasn't her first job, but it was by far the grandest place she'd ever worked. Still, she reminded herself, same human needs, no matter the house. Mrs. Clarkson greeted her at the door, eyeing her with the practiced caution of someone used to hiring and losing staff. "Come in, Miss Susan. Mr. Blake is in the sunroom. I'll walk you through the routine, though he'll likely ignore you at first." "I'm used to that," Susan replied gently. "I'll take things slow." They entered the sunroom where the once proud businessman sat in a wheelchair, half covered by a blanket, gazing out the window with distant eyes. His hands, spotted with age, lay still in his lap. There was a time he'd bark orders with those same hands, pointing, commanding, leading boardrooms. Now he barely spoke. "Mr. Blake, this is Nurse Susan. She'll be looking after you," Clarkson said, her tone more ceremonial than hopeful. Harold's eyes flicked over to the young woman. No nod. No acknowledgement. Susan stepped forward anyway, squatting slightly to meet his gaze. "Good morning, Mr. Blake. It's an honor to meet you. I'll be here to help, quietly, respectfully. And I'll try not to talk too much unless you want me to." Silence. Clarkson gave Susan a look that said, "Don't expect too much." Then she left them. Susan unpacked slowly in the guest wing near Harold's room. Just a few clothes, her stethoscope, and a small wooden box that carried old sheet music. She put her things away and took a walk around the estate. Every nurse she'd spoken to at the agency had warned her, "He's rich, he's bitter, and he won't like you." But Susan believed in something else, something her late mother always told her. People don't lose their souls. They just forget where they left them. That night, Susan brought Harold his evening medication and sat beside him. She didn't ask questions or push conversation. She only read from the newspaper, her voice soft and unhurried. He didn't respond, but he didn't ask her to stop either. When she turned off the lamp, leaving only the moonlight through the window, she noticed his breathing was still uneven, eyes flickering open every few minutes. She hesitated, then reached for something familiar. Humming at first, just quietly, a lullaby her mother used to sing to her and her sisters back in their small apartment. The words were simple, the melody older than memory. Her voice, soft as a breeze, filled the room like incense. She didn't look at Harold, but when she rose to leave, she noticed his eyes had finally shut. And for the first time since she arrived, the air in the room felt peaceful. The second night began like the first. The hallway was dimly lit, the estate cloaked in a kind of haunted hush that only large, quiet homes carry after sundown. Susan walked the long corridor toward Mr. Blake's room, her footsteps soundless on the thick carpets. She carried a small ceramic bowl of warm water for his face and hands. He liked it just before bed, Mrs. Clarkson had said, and a well-worn paperback novel in case he felt like listening. When she entered the room, she found him already awake, sitting propped against his pillows, his fingers fidgeting slowly with the corner of the blanket. He didn't look up as she approached, but his breathing was calmer than the night before. "Good evening, Mr. Blake," she said gently. "I hope you had a peaceful day." No reply. That didn't bother her anymore. She set the bowl on the nightstand, soaked a cloth, and gently began to wipe his hands, slow, practiced strokes. He didn't pull away. "I brought a book tonight. Just some light fiction. Nothing too dramatic." She held it up, though he wasn't looking. "Or I can just sit here in silence. Whatever you prefer." His gaze remained fixed on the ceiling, but Susan swore she saw the barest flicker of acknowledgement in the corners of his eyes, like the tiniest nod a tired soul makes when it doesn't have the energy to speak. She sat in the armchair beside him, opened the book, and began to read. Her voice was low and deliberate, with the smooth cadence of someone who understood that tone could be more comforting than words. For 20 minutes, she read. When she reached the end of a chapter, she glanced up and saw his head tilted slightly toward her. His eyes were closed, but not from exhaustion, from rest. Susan smiled to herself and closed the book. Then, without thinking, without planning, she began to hum. It wasn't the lullaby from the night before. It was another tune, older, perhaps French, perhaps borrowed from some film or record her mother used to play during quiet evenings. A melody that carried no lyrics but carried feeling, warmth, comfort, home. As she hummed, her voice filled the room like water poured into an empty bowl. The old man's fingers stopped fidgeting. His breathing deepened. Susan continued, not loud or theatrical, but soft and heartfelt. She didn't sing for applause. She didn't even know she was being heard beyond the man in the bed. But down the hall, behind another closed door, Nathan Blake sat at his desk, having returned only the day before without fanfare. A heavy binder of contracts lay open before him, but he hadn't turned a page in 15 minutes. He sat frozen, pen still in hand, staring at nothing. That voice. It started faint, barely audible over the hum of the central air and the crackling of a distant fireplace. But there it was, delicate, full of sorrow and sweetness all at once. A woman's voice. No instruments. No rhythm. Just melody. He stood up, walked quietly to his door, and opened it just enough to hear better. At first, he thought it was a recording. One of the staff listening to something after hours. But then the realization struck him. The direction. The timing. The silence that always followed it. It was live. It was real. It was for his father. Back in the room, Susan was finishing the last note. She didn't know Nathan was listening. She didn't know that, for the first time in years, a man who'd built an empire on logic and calculation was suddenly held captive by something irrational, tender, and unguarded. When she turned off the bedside lamp and gently pulled the blanket up to Harold's chest, she whispered, "Sleep well, Mr. Blake." And though he said nothing, his lips parted ever so slightly. It wasn't a word, but it might have been the beginning of one. As Susan left the room, she paused outside the door, her hand resting on the knob. She closed her eyes for a moment, as though sealing the melody behind her. Down the hall, Nathan stepped back into his room, quietly closing his door. For the first time in weeks, neither father nor son felt alone in that house. Nathan Blake wasn't a man who lingered in places that made him feel uncomfortable. He was used to sleek hotel suites, open-concept offices with glass walls, and the sterile silence of first-class lounges. The Blake estate, his boyhood home, was different. It wasn't just old, it was burdened. The corridors echoed with footsteps that no longer passed through them. Every painting, every antique table, seemed to demand he remember things he'd rather forget. He had returned 2 days ago, almost unannounced, under the guise of checking on the estate. In truth, his father's condition had weighed on him more than he let on, even if he hadn't spoken to Harold in months. His team in New York didn't question it. Nathan Blake could disappear when he wanted to. He always came back with sharper focus and twice the ambition. But focus was proving difficult. The second night after his return, Nathan sat at his old mahogany desk, deep in the west wing of the estate, surrounded by reports he had no interest in reading. A sharp gin on the rocks sat half-melted beside his laptop. His eyes drifted toward the hallway. There it was again. The voice. Soft. Rich. Barely louder than a whisper. But it traveled. Not just through the air, but through the walls. Through the past. He rose from the chair slowly, setting the glass down with care, and walked toward the door. It creaked faintly as he opened it just a few inches. The song reached him more clearly now, unfurling like silk through the corridor. No lyrics tonight, just humming. Controlled, soothing, mournful yet hopeful. The kind of melody that made you ache in places you didn't know were empty. He recognized the direction. His father's room. Leaning against the doorframe, Nathan felt something stir, confusion first, then curiosity. It wasn't just that the voice was beautiful. It was the intention behind it. It was clear this wasn't for show, not for anyone's benefit. Whoever was singing did it out of something deeply personal. He closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him. And then, unexpectedly, he saw his mother. She used to hum like that. When she baked. When she brushed his hair as a boy. When she read on the patio during summer evenings. It hit him with a sudden clarity. He hadn't thought of her voice in years. But now, this stranger's song had brought it all back in a wave so vivid he almost reached out, as if the memory could be touched. A door creaked down the hall, snapping him back. He pulled his own door gently shut and stepped back into the dim room, heart beating faster than it should. He didn't even know the woman's name. The nurse, he assumed. One of the many. Hired. Assigned. Replaceable. But there was nothing replaceable about what he'd just heard. The next morning, he rose early. The sky outside his window was a canvas of bruised pink and gold. He showered, dressed simply, dark jeans, a white shirt, sleeves rolled up, and wandered toward the kitchen in search of coffee. Not out of habit, out of purpose. He heard the soft clink of porcelain before he saw her. She was standing by the kettle, pouring hot water into a teacup. Her back was to him, but he noticed how still she was, no rush, no noise. She wore a plain navy sweater and slacks, hair tied up in a patterned scarf. There was something dignified about her stillness. Self-contained. He cleared his throat. She turned, startled just slightly, her hand pausing midair. "Good morning," he said, trying not to sound too formal or too casual. "Good morning," she replied, placing the kettle down gently. Their eyes met for the first time. Nathan noticed two things right away. Her eyes were large, dark, observant. And she didn't look intimidated, which, for some reason, threw him off. "I'm Nathan," he said, offering a hand. "Harold's son." Susan hesitated, then wiped her hand discreetly on a napkin and shook his. "Susan, I'm your father's nurse." He nodded. "You've been singing." A flicker passed over her face. Not embarrassment, something more like guardedness. "Yes," she said. "He has trouble sleeping. I thought it might help." Nathan tilted his head slightly. "Where'd you learn to sing like that?" She looked down at her cup for a moment. "From my mother. She believed music made pain quieter. I'm not trained or anything. You don't need to be." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full. Nathan poured himself a coffee, watching her from the corner of his eye. She didn't fidget. She didn't ask questions about him. She didn't mention his wealth or his companies. And he found that refreshing, disarming, even. As she turned to leave, cup in hand, she paused at the doorway. "Your father sleeps better when he hears music," she said softly. "I think he remembers things through it. Good things." Then she disappeared down the hallway, leaving Nathan alone with his coffee and the faintest echo of her voice still lingering in the room. For the first time since returning, he smiled to himself. He would make a point to hear her sing again. The morning air had a gentle coolness to it, softened by the warmth of sunlight spilling through the estate's tall kitchen windows. Dust motes danced lazily in the light, floating between the pots and spice jars like suspended music notes. Susan was slicing apples at the wide marble counter. She moved with quiet rhythm, each cut precise, her mind somewhere else, perhaps already in the day ahead. Helping Harold with his exercises, preparing his tea, checking his vitals, reading aloud from the novel he seemed to secretly enjoy even if he never admitted it. She didn't hear the footsteps behind her at first. "Those apples smell like a memory," a voice said. Susan turned sharply, the paring knife still in her hand. Standing near the door was Nathan, a steaming mug in one hand, the other casually tucked into the pocket of his slacks. His smile was gentle, almost apologetic. "I didn't mean to startle you," he added. Susan's eyes narrowed slightly, her natural reflex when someone interrupted her focus, but she relaxed just enough to nod. "You didn't. I just wasn't expecting company this early." Nathan moved closer, the aroma of coffee following him. "You always cook breakfast?" "Not always," she replied, returning to the apples. "But Mr. Blake mentioned he liked fruit with cinnamon in the mornings. So I thought I'd try something simple." Nathan leaned a little on the edge of the counter. "Funny. I didn't know my father had preferences anymore." Susan glanced at him. "He may not say much, but he notices more than people think." Nathan studied her. Up close, she was even more intriguing. There was an unshakable calm to her, something still, grounded. Her voice had the same timbre as her singing, low, rich, unhurried. She didn't shrink under his gaze like others sometimes did. In fact, she looked at him like she was assessing him, not the other way around. He liked that. "You sang again last night," he said. Susan's hands slowed, just for a moment. "Yes." He watched her carefully. "Do you always sing to your patients?" "Only the ones who look like they've forgotten how to rest." She didn't smile when she said it, but something softened behind her eyes. Nathan chuckled lightly. "My father's not an easy man to soothe. You're the first nurse he hasn't driven away in weeks." "I'm not here to fight him," she said simply. "I'm here to see if he still wants to feel human." The room went quiet. Nathan looked down at his cup, swirling the coffee as if it would tell him something. "You know, when I was a kid, he used to play Sinatra in the living room. Really loud. The neighbors hated us for it." Susan looked at him then, curious. "He doesn't talk about his younger days." "He doesn't talk, period," Nathan muttered, then caught himself. "Sorry. I don't mean to vent." She wiped her hands on a cloth and turned to face him. "It's okay to vent. But for what it's worth, I don't think he's stopped caring. I think he's just forgotten how to show it." Nathan raised an eyebrow. "You get all that from singing to him?" Susan gave a small, knowing smile. "You'd be surprised what silence tells you when you stop being afraid of it." That silenced Nathan. Not in an awkward way, just long enough for her words to echo. A phone buzzed somewhere in the distance. Probably the estate manager. But neither moved. "You know," Nathan said after a pause, "I've been around music my whole life. Concerts, opera, jazz clubs. Nothing quite landed like your voice did through the walls last night." Susan's lips parted slightly in surprise, not expecting the compliment. "Thank you. I'm not flattering you," he added quickly, noticing the modest reaction. "I'm just stating a fact." "I don't sing to be heard," she said quietly. "I sing to help people remember who they are." Nathan stared at her a moment longer. Then, with the smallest hint of a smile, he stepped back. "Well," he said, lifting his mug in a mock toast, "thank you for helping him remember. Maybe you're helping me too." Susan looked down, hiding a smile. "Careful. I charge double for 2 patients." Nathan laughed. It was brief but genuine, something rare from him these days. As he left the kitchen, the warm scent of cinnamon and apples followed him, mixing with the memory of her voice in his head. Susan watched him go, her expression unreadable. She wasn't sure what she'd expected when she took this job. Certainly not him. But for the first time in a long while, something stirred in her too. Something unfamiliar. She picked up another apple and began to slice, the rhythm returning to her hands. But her thoughts were no longer on the fruit. It started with a chair. More precisely, Nathan dragging a chair into the sunroom one slow afternoon and sitting there, just far enough not to intrude, just close enough to observe. Harold was in his usual spot, reclined beneath the wide glass windows, hands folded over a light blanket. His eyes were half closed, the way they always were now, as though life had dimmed the world into something worth watching, but not participating in. Susan was reading to him. Her voice was smooth, like falling water over warm stones. She didn't rush, didn't overact. She read like the words were being lived in real time. The corners of Nathan's mouth twitched at the way she paused for effect, just slightly, when something humorous occurred in the novel. As if she believed Harold might laugh if given enough space to remember how. Nathan had no business being there. His laptop sat unopened on a side table nearby, the blinking light of an unanswered message glowing through the leather case. But he stayed, because Harold's shoulders weren't as tight as they used to be, because his father seemed more there when Susan was present, because if he were honest, Nathan had nowhere else he wanted to be. The next day, he found himself in the kitchen again. Susan was making tea, humming faintly, something Nathan didn't recognize. He didn't speak at first, just listened. When she finally noticed him, she offered a quiet smile and poured him a second cup without asking. They sipped in comfortable silence. "You always this calm in the morning?" he asked eventually. "Only when there's chamomile involved," she replied with a faint grin. Nathan chuckled, then leaned against the counter. "Tell me something about yourself." "Anything." She gave him a curious glance. "You don't strike me as the type who asks questions just to ask." "I'm not," he admitted. "But I'm starting to realize how much I don't know about the people right in front of me." Susan looked away briefly, thoughtful. "I'm the oldest of 4. Grew up in a small town outside Port Harcourt. I studied nursing because my mother was always sick, and we couldn't afford care." Nathan's eyes softened. "That's a lot of weight for one person." She shrugged gently. "We carry what we must. My sisters say I sing like her. They don't remember, but I do." "And now you sing for my father," Nathan said. Her smile faded into something quieter. "Your father, he listens in a way most people don't. Even in silence. Like music is the only thing that still reaches him." Nathan looked at her, suddenly struck by how closely she'd been observing Harold. How much she understood about a man even Nathan had kept at arm's length. It stung a little, in the way truth does when it's presented without accusation. "You get him," he said, more to himself than to her. "I try." They sipped their tea. A breeze moved through the half-open window, stirring the lace curtain. Then came a clatter. From down the hallway, Harold's voice, a short grunt, followed by the unmistakable sound of something falling. Susan was already moving before Nathan had fully registered it. They reached the room at the same time. Harold had dropped his water glass. It lay shattered across the floor. He sat still, visibly frustrated, his fingers twitching uselessly at the armrest of his chair. Susan knelt beside him immediately. "It's okay, Mr. Blake. No harm done." He opened his mouth to speak, but all that came was a long, trembling exhale. She took his hand gently, holding it in both of hers. Nathan stood in the doorway, watching. "Do you want music?" she asked softly. Harold didn't answer, but his shoulders dropped a little, just enough. Without standing, Susan began to hum. Not a lullaby this time, but something more upbeat, playful, light. A tune Nathan faintly recognized from old records his mother used to play. She was improvising slightly, letting her voice rise and fall in a way that sounded like conversation with notes. Nathan watched in silence. His father's hand slowly stilled in hers. His jaw unclenched. And Nathan felt, again, that strange pull in his chest, the feeling of something beginning. Something important. Something he hadn't asked for, but was now grateful to witness. Later that evening, Nathan walked past the piano in the sitting room. He hadn't touched it in years. He sat down slowly, fingers brushing the keys. They were out of tune slightly, but familiar. He played the first few notes of the melody Susan had hummed that afternoon. They weren't perfect, but they carried the shape of her voice. Behind him, a soft laugh. He turned. Susan stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her smile teasing. "You play?" she asked. "Barely," he said. "Just enough to embarrass myself." She walked in, standing beside the piano. "That was the song from today." "I remembered it," he said. "Or maybe you made it hard to forget." There was a pause. "Play it again," she said. "I'll sing." Nathan stared at her for a moment. Then, wordlessly, he placed his fingers on the keys. She began to sing. This time not for Harold. This time for them. It happened on a Thursday, under a sky full of gathering clouds. The estate was unusually lively that day. A catering van had arrived early in the morning, followed by a gleaming black SUV that swept through the iron gates with the arrogance of something that never had to ask permission. Inside were two guests, Elliot Sharp, Nathan's oldest friend and business partner, and Lauren, Elliot's model-perfect girlfriend. Stiletto heels, designer sunglasses, and a glance that missed nothing and forgave even less. Nathan had invited them last minute, on impulse. He'd told himself it was a casual check-in, a way to entertain company during his impromptu stay at the estate. But truthfully, he hadn't expected Elliot to accept. And he definitely hadn't anticipated how disruptive the presence of old acquaintances would feel in the house that had begun to breathe differently lately. Softer, warmer. When the car pulled up, Nathan was already on the front porch. "Still hiding out with the ghosts, huh?" Elliot joked, stepping out with a grin. "You look half domesticated already." Nathan forced a laugh. "Come in. Just don't spook the furniture." Inside, the staff buzzed around, tidying rooms that hadn't needed tidying. Susan, as usual, moved quietly through it all, staying close to Harold, shielding him with her calm presence from the sudden influx of noise and cologne and champagne flutes. She hadn't been introduced yet, not officially, until lunch. The table was long and polished, set with precision. Elliot sat at one end, gesturing wildly as he recounted some story about investors and artificial intelligence and the deal they nearly lost in Singapore. Susan sat at the opposite end beside Harold, helping him with his soup in measured, respectful silence. Lauren, bored and predatory, sized up the room. Her eyes landed on Susan. "So," she said suddenly, cutting across Elliot's speech. "You're the singer nurse." Susan paused mid-spoon. "I'm Mr. Blake's nurse, yes." "And you sing to him?" Lauren's tone was light, but laced with something sharp, like glass under velvet. "How charming. That's not in the job description, is it?" Susan blinked, composed. "No, it's something I chose to do." "Well, it must be effective. Nathan practically wrote a poem about it last night," Lauren said with a quick, mocking laugh, sipping from her flute. Elliot joined in. "Yeah, man. You going soft out here? Should we be worried about a romantic retreat into hospice care?" Nathan set his fork down. "All right," he said, voice even. "That's enough." Lauren raised a brow. "I'm just saying it's adorable. A Florence Nightingale situation. Very classic. Very. Noble servant falls for the heir." She gave Susan a tight smile. "You must be very talented to be so noticed." The room chilled. Susan stood slowly, folding her napkin. "Excuse me." She left the room without another word. Nathan pushed back his chair with a scrape. "What the hell was that?" Elliot raised his hands. "Easy. It's a joke. It wasn't funny." "She's a nurse, Nate," Lauren added. "Don't pretend this is something it's not." Nathan stared at her, something dark passing behind his eyes. "You don't know her," he said coldly. "And after that you won't." Then he stood and followed Susan, leaving his glass, his guests, and years of superficial loyalty behind. He found her in the garden. She was standing alone beneath the sycamore tree, arms crossed, not crying, but still. Too still. "Susan," he said softly. She didn't turn. "I'm sorry," he said. "They shouldn't have spoken to you like that." "They spoke to me the way people like them speak to people like me," she said. Her voice was level, but quiet pain ran underneath like a low current. They didn't say anything new. Nathan stepped closer. That's not who I am. Isn't it? She asked, finally turning to face him. They're your people. You didn't correct them until they humiliated me. You didn't say I'm not just a nurse. You didn't say that I matter beyond the song. Nathan felt it like a slap, not from cruelty but from truth. I didn't know what to say, he admitted. I froze. You've lived your whole life with people who see others as entertainment or decoration, she said. And now you think this, she gestured between them, is just going to rewrite all of that? I think it could. Susan shook her head. I can't be part of a world that pats me on the head and calls it affection. I've worked too hard to be someone's passing curiosity. Nathan stepped back, his chest tightening. You think that's what you are to me? She looked at him, really looked. I don't know what I am to you. And right now, I don't think you do either. Then she turned and walked away, leaving him alone beneath the tree. That night, for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, the house went silent. No song echoed down the hallway. No humming floated through the walls. Harold didn't sleep. Nathan didn't sleep. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. And in that silence, the bond they'd all begun to build cracked, not broken, but fragile now, waiting to be rebuilt or lost. The rain came that night. It wasn't loud or violent, just steady, like a drumbeat of sorrow against the old windows of the Blake estate. The kind of rain that soaked the earth slowly, the kind that mirrored the mood of those inside. Nathan stood at the piano. He hadn't intended to go there. He'd wandered through the house like a man lost in his own history, every room reminding him of what had just slipped through his fingers. But his feet brought him back to the sitting room, and there he stood, fingers resting silently on the keys. He hadn't seen Susan since the confrontation in the garden. He'd watched her withdraw, not just physically but inwardly. Gone was the quiet, unshakable strength that had lit the corners of every room she entered. She still did her duties, of course. Susan didn't know how to give anything less than her full care. But her voice, her warmth, her music, they were gone. And with them, the light in Harold's eyes had begun to fade again. Nathan pressed a single key. It rang out low and soft. He remembered what she said, that she sang not to be heard, but to help people remember who they were. So who was he now? Elsewhere in the house, Susan stood at Harold's bedside, holding his hand. He looked at her with weary eyes, something unsaid hovering in the stillness between them. His breathing was heavier these days. Not labored, but more deliberate, as though each inhale came with thought, with effort. You didn't sing tonight, he said. It came out hoarse. Unsteady. Susan looked down, surprised. It was the first full sentence he'd spoken to her without prompting. No, she said softly. I didn't. A long pause. I miss it, Harold whispered. Her heart tightened. I'm sorry, she said, squeezing his hand. I didn't think it would matter. It does. His voice cracked, and she looked at him again, really looked. Not as her patient. Not as a duty. But as a man trying to hold on to something more than life. Peace, perhaps. Or beauty. Or memory. She knew what she had to do. Minutes later, the house went still again. The air seemed to wait, hushed by the rhythm of the rain. Then slowly, like a breeze pushing open a forgotten window, her voice returned. At first, Nathan thought he imagined it. He'd just placed his hands back on the keys, unsure whether to play or walk away when the sound came. A soft note. Then another. He turned toward the hallway, listening. The melody was unfamiliar. It wasn't the lullabies or old jazz pieces she usually hummed. It was slower, deeper, built not from nostalgia, but from something raw. Real. It was hers. Susan stood in Harold's room, the light from the bedside lamp catching the edges of her face, her eyes closed as she sang. The words were her own, written late at night on pages no one had seen, born of joy and confusion and something tender she hadn't dared name. Her voice trembled at first. Then it steadied. And it rose. The lyrics were about silence and what lives underneath it. About the ache of being seen and still misunderstood. About finding your voice, then losing it in someone else's story. About love. And Nathan heard every word. He followed the voice to the edge of the room, but didn't step inside. He stayed in the shadows, his breath caught in his throat, as if moving would break the spell. Then Susan saw him. Their eyes met, and the song faltered. Just a note. Just a second. But Harold squeezed her hand. So she kept singing. Nathan stepped inside slowly. At the foot of the bed, he didn't speak. He simply listened, letting her voice wrap around the ache between them. Letting the truth settle not through explanations, but through melody. When she finished, the silence that followed was not empty. It was sacred. Harold, eyes closed now, breathed easier. Nathan knelt beside her. I was wrong, he said. About so many things. She didn't look at him. I know. I didn't stand up when I should have. I let you feel small in a place where you've made everyone feel whole. Her hand twitched in Harold's, but she didn't let go. I see you, Susan, he said, voice cracking. Not because of your songs. Not because of what you did for my father. I see you because you showed me what grace looks like. And I want to be the kind of man who deserves to be heard by you. Susan turned to him, finally. Her eyes were full, but not broken. You hurt me, she said quietly. Not because of what they said, but because I thought you were different. I want to be. Don't say it, she whispered, sing it. Nathan looked at her, unsure. But then, he rose, stepped to the piano in the corner of the room, and sat. He didn't know her melody perfectly. He couldn't match her voice. But he remembered the chords. And slowly, reverently, he played. Susan joined him. One voice, one piano. And between them, an old man who smiled as sleep gently took him. The sun rose gently over the Blake estate, its rays cutting through the morning mist like soft gold threads. The sky was clean and wide, the kind of blue that felt like a beginning. Inside, the old house breathed differently now. It no longer echoed with ghosts, but hummed with life, quiet, slow, but present. Harold Blake sat in a wheelchair beneath the wide awning of the garden patio, a wool blanket draped across his legs. A teacup rested in his lap, untouched but warm. His face had changed. Not by time, but by something more subtle. A lightness in his eyes, a peace in the corners of his mouth that hadn't existed in years. He looked out at the lawn, where two figures moved among the sunbeams, laughing, playfully arguing about how to carry a crate of music books. Susan and Nathan. She wore a loose white blouse and jeans dusted with garden soil. A small smudge of chalk clung to her cheek, where she'd absent-mindedly wiped her hand. Nathan had ditched his suit jacket somewhere on the porch, sleeves rolled up, his hands ink-stained from labeling boxes. They looked happy. Unscripted. Unpolished. Real. Harold smiled to himself. The music therapy center was nearly ready. Nathan had bought the small building on the edge of the city, once an abandoned dance hall, now slowly being transformed into a place of healing. He didn't put his name on the project. It was hers. Susan's idea. Susan's design. But he'd made sure it had everything she dreamed of. Instruments for all ages, quiet rooms with soft lights, soundproof walls for patients who needed privacy, open ones for those ready to sing out loud. They called it the Echo Room, because, as Susan said, every person has a sound. They just need to hear it back. That afternoon, as Nathan loaded the last of the supplies into the SUV, he looked up to find Susan watching him from the porch. She held 2 glasses of lemonade. Her eyes gleamed in the sun. You always this helpful? She asked, handing him a glass. Only when bribed with citrus, he replied. They sat on the steps together, close but easy, their shoulders brushing. The air smelled of rosemary and old roses. Bees droned lazily in the nearby hedge. He turned to her. We should celebrate. After the opening. I don't need champagne, she said. No, but I was thinking something more daring. She gave him a teasing glance. Like what? He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small box, and held it out. Susan froze. He opened it. Inside, not a ring. A charm. A tiny, delicate silver treble clef on a slender chain. For your voice, he said softly. And because I'm not done hearing you sing. She looked at it for a long moment, then at him. I thought you might propose. Nathan smirked. That's next week. She laughed, truly laughed. The sound carried across the garden, over the hedges, and back again. She leaned her head on his shoulder. I don't need grand gestures, she said. Just you. Present. Kind. Trying. I can do that, he said. With you, I want to. That evening, back inside, Harold sat at his desk. He hadn't written a letter in years. But his hand, though slow, moved steadily across the cream-colored paper. My dear friend, it turns out I have one more story to live before I go. A young woman came into this house and brought music where there was only silence. My son heard her, and in doing so remembered who he was. And I remembered I was still a father. They don't know it yet, but their love has healed more than each other. It healed me. He signed it with care. H. Blake. Later that night, as the stars took their place above the estate, Nathan sat at the piano. Susan stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder, their laughter lingering between them like the tail end of a song. She began to sing. No audience, no stage, just two people who had nothing to prove and everything to share. Her voice, now fully hers again, danced with light. Not a ballad this time, not a lullaby, just joy improvised and fearless. And Nathan joined in, not with words, but with harmony. From his room, Harold listened. His eyes closed, hands resting peacefully on the arms of his chair. He smiled. And the old house, once too quiet, filled with music again. But this time not to soothe pain, to celebrate life. We have come to the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a like and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more interesting stories.